Okay, by now you should have completed the backwards verbs level 1 in um, Conjuguemos. I know that was a little confusing to get started, but it only took you about 10 minutes to figure it out by yourself, and it probably would have taken me 20 minutes to talk through all of that, and then you probably still would have taken another 10 minutes to figure it out. So it's fine that maybe you made a few mistakes. That's not for credit. It's just trying to teach you the first step of something that the first step is the most important part. It's the backwards verbs. These are verbs that work like gustar. And I'll show you later why I call them backwards verbs. But let me go ahead now that you've gone through this and tell you specifically what I'm hoping that you're going to do differently from most of the people that do backwards verbs. Most people do, and you've probably been there. Your teacher explains logically how the verb gustar works, and you think, well, hey, that's a little confusing, so I think I can find some gimmicks that'll help me through the test. And so you learn your gimmicks, and this is exactly what my fourth year students had done when I tried to teach them how to do gustar and the other backwards verbs. My AP kids aren't very good at these either. What happens is you learn the gimmicks, you get through the test, because our brains don't remember gibberish very well. But as soon as the test is over, you forget how to do it. Gimmicks are not a good way to speak Spanish, so they're not useful to you in order to be able to actually use this stuff. And also, not only do you have a hard time keeping track of the gimmicks that get you through gustar, but if you're going to learn how to do it by gimmicks, you're going to have to learn a different gimmick for every backwards verb. What I'm going to try to teach you is the logic behind all this, especially the first step, and show you how that you can eventually show you how you can apply the same first step to no matter which backwards verb it is that you're trying to work with. So for our first example, though, we're going to start with gustar, and which you should be pretty comfortable with at this point. And I'm going to take you through the logic behind all of this and show you how to get from step 1 to step 2. All right, so you're looking here at the sentence, I like the cheese. And the problem with this sentence is you can't translate it directly. There is no verb that means to like. There's no concept of liking in Spanish. And so obviously we're into another situation, sort of like she is thirsty, where we don't say is, and we don't use the word for thirsty. We say she has thirst. It's one of those situations where the way we translate it really doesn't reflect what it means. Liking doesn't exist in Spanish. No verb exists that means to like. So we have to work around that. But a lot of people just like to pretend that the verb gustar means to like. They learn a bunch of gimmicks to get around that, and it never works. What we don't want to do is pretend that gustar means to like. What we do want to do is learn how to take a good first step that explains everything else, makes everything else logical, and that we can use for all other backwards verbs. So you can't translate something that doesn't exist. We have to figure out how the same idea, sort of like having fun, the concept of fun doesn't exist. We talk about passing it well. We talk about diverting oneself. We have to figure out how this idea is expressed in Spanish. What we're going to do is when we try to say this in Spanish, the closest thing we can get is the cheese pleases me. Now, the huge difference here in terms of explaining why gustar seems to be such a strange verb is that now all of a sudden, instead of I doing the action of liking, we have the cheese doing the action of pleasing. The cheese is the subject, and that's what that first step is for all of this, is understanding what the subject is in the Spanish sentence. You always want to start with understanding what are we really saying in Spanish. We want to translate a sentence that does exist, and the key to that is asking what is the subject in the Spanish sentence. So for we like school, we know liking doesn't exist, so we have to ask ourselves what's the closest thing we can get to. We can say that school pleases us. So let's try a few examples here. You give me your guess, and then I'll give you the answer. She likes to practice. We can't say she likes. We want to say practicing pleases her. You like Indianapolis. Liking doesn't exist. We're instead going to say Indianapolis pleases you. I like her romantically. liking doesn't exist. We're not talking about loving here. We're going to say, she pleases me. And they like me romantically. I please them. So, this step 1 is crucial. If you get it wrong, you're doomed even before you start thinking about Spanish. But again, the payoff is if you understand how to do the first step, you get to apply the same way of thinking to all the backwards verbs and save yourselves a ton of time. Also, this is logical, and our brains are good at remembering things that are logical. Now, step 2. We start with step 1, I like the cheese. We want to translate the sentence instead, the cheese pleases me. And step 2 is figure out then, now that we know what the subject is in the Spanish sentence, how are we going to conjugate that verb in the Spanish sentence? Gustar is to please, cheese is singular, gustar becomes gusta. It makes perfect sense because the cheese pleases, it's a he or she, and we use the he or she form. Once you know the subject and the verb ending, remember they're called backwards verbs. We're just going to think right to left and write a completely normal sentence, basically. So we start with, I like the cheese. That doesn't exist. We have to say, the cheese pleases me. So then we translate backwards. All right. Starting with the subject in the Spanish sentence is the cheese. That's going to go on the end. These are backwards verbs. It's going to go on the end of the Spanish sentence. And then we work from right to left. Gusta, the verb that perfectly is conjugated right to go along with el queso. And then me. So we notice that it's gusta, not gusto. If you don't start with the subject in the Spanish sentence, the cheese, it sure seems like it should be gusto. If you're going to pretend that gustar means to like, sure seems like it should be gusto. But it's gusta because the cheese is the subject. Gusta, and then not I, because I'm not doing anything in this sentence. The cheese pleases me. Me gusta el queso. All right, she likes to practice. Step 1 is, what's the subject in the Spanish sentence? Practicing pleases her. We start with the Spanish subject, practicing, working right to left, gusta. Practicing is one thing, singular, gusta. And then le is the word we're going to use for him or her there. She likes me, romantically, is I please her. And working right to left, we have our subject. I put that in parentheses because we know that subject pronouns can be left out when we don't have to worry about being unclear. And we don't, because gusto has got the O on the end that tells us it's I please, right? And then in front of that is going to be that same word that you can use for him or her, which is le. So yo, and then gusto, and then le. Subject, conjugated verb, regular old AR verb, and then le in front of that.